The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Riverside Grill as I stared at my husband's phone screen. There, in the dim candlelight of our 5th wedding anniversary dinner, I saw a message that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. The text was from my own sister Vanessa, and the words burned into my memory like acid. Can't wait for you to leave her, and finally be with me. Tonight changes everything. My love. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening had started so perfectly. Ryan had surprised me with reservations at the most exclusive restaurant in Denver, the same place where he'd proposed 3 years earlier. I'd spent hours getting ready, choosing the emerald dress he'd always complimented, styling my auburn hair into loose waves that cascaded down my shoulder. Our relationship had weathered some storms lately, mostly work stress and the usual challenges of married life, but I thought this dinner was his way of reconnecting, of showing me that our marriage still mattered to him. I should have noticed the signs earlier. The way Ryan kept checking his phone throughout dinner, the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from him every time it buzzed, the way his eyes would dart away from mine when I tried to engage him in conversation about our future plans. When his phone rang for the 3rd time during our appetizer course, I'd finally spoken up. "Just turn it off for one night," I'd said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "This is supposed to be about us." Ryan had looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between guilt and irritation. "You know I can't do that, Natalie. The Morrison campaign launch is tomorrow, and if there's a crisis with the social media strategy, I need to be available." His excuse made sense on the surface. Ryan was the creative director at Creative Edge Marketing, one of Denver's most prestigious advertising agencies, and the Morrison political campaign was their biggest client of the year. I understood the pressure he was under, the long hours he'd been putting in for the past 3 months. What I didn't understand was why every phone call seemed to drain the color from his face, why every text message made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. The 4th call came just as our main courses arrived. Ryan glanced at the caller ID and practically jumped from his seat. "I'm sorry, but I really need to take this one. It'll just be a minute. I promise." He stepped away from our table, moving toward the restaurant's entrance, where the reception was better. I watched him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, pacing back and forth on the sidewalk outside, his free hand gesturing animatedly as he spoke. The conversation lasted much longer than a minute. I picked at my salmon, watching the hollandaise sauce congeal as my appetite slowly disappeared. When Ryan returned 15 minutes later, he seemed even more agitated than before. His usually perfectly styled dark hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and there was a sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the cool October evening. "Everything okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. In 5 years together, I'd never seen him this stressed about work. "Fine, just some last-minute changes to the campaign strategy. Nothing I can't handle." He picked up his fork and began cutting his steak with mechanical precision. Avoiding my gaze, we ate in relative silence for the next 20 minutes. The romantic atmosphere I'd been hoping for slowly evaporating like morning fog. Ryan's phone continued to buzz intermittently, each notification causing him to tense visibly. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Ryan, what's really going on? You've been acting strange for weeks, and tonight was supposed to be special. It's our anniversary." He looked up at me then, and for a brief moment, I saw something that looked almost like panic in his brown eyes. "I know, and I'm sorry. After tomorrow, things will calm down. I promise. The campaign will be launched, and we can focus on us again." I wanted to believe him. Part of me was desperate to believe him, but there was something in his tone, something in the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes, that made my stomach twist with unease. I'd been married to this man for 5 years. Dated him for 2 years before that. I knew when he was lying. Is there someone else? The question escaped my lips before I could stop it, hanging in the air between us like a loaded weapon. Ryan's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went completely white, and he nearly choked on the piece of steak he'd been chewing. "What? No. Natalie, how could you even think that?" But his denial rang hollow, delivered with just a fraction too much force, accompanied by just a moment too much delay. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a creeping certainty that my worst fears were about to be confirmed. "Then why won't you look at me? Why have you been so distant lately? Why does every phone call make you look like you've seen a ghost?" Before Ryan could answer, his phone buzzed again. This time, instead of checking it discreetly, he made the mistake of placing it face up on the table while he reached for his water glass. The notification preview was clearly visible in the dim candlelight, and my world tilted on its axis as I read the sender's name. Vanessa Harper. My time seemed to slow down as I reached for the phone, my movements feeling thick and dreamlike. Ryan lunged forward to stop me, but his reaction was too late. I'd already seen enough of the message preview to understand that my marriage was over. "Can't wait for you to leave her and finally be with me. Tonight changes everything. My love." The champagne glass fell from my numb fingers, the sound of shattering crystals somehow distant and muffled. Other diners turned to look at our table, but I barely registered their curious stare. All I could focus on was the phone in my hands, and the devastating reality of what I was reading. Ryan was having an affair with my sister, not just any affair, but one that had apparently been going on long enough for them to make plans, to talk about a future together, a future that didn't include me. "Natalie, I can explain," Ryan started, his voice barely above a whisper, but I was already scrolling through their text conversation, my finger moving with mechanical precision as months of deception unfolded before my eyes. The messages went back to July, starting innocuously enough with Ryan asking Vanessa for advice about a surprise for my birthday, but by August, the tone had shifted completely. "I can't stop thinking about last night," Vanessa had written on August 15th. "When can we see each other again?" "Soon," Ryan had replied. "I just need to find the right time to tell Natalie." "This is killing me. You know she was never right for you," came Vanessa's response. "She's too soft, too naive for someone with your ambitions. We understand each other in ways she never could." The messages became increasingly intimate as the weeks progressed. Plans for secret meetings, declarations of love, discussions about how to handle the Natalie situation. They talked about me like I was an obstacle to be overcome, a problem to be solved rather than a human being with feelings and a life that was about to be destroyed. The most recent messages from earlier that day painted a clear picture of their intention. Vanessa had written, "Are you going to tell her tonight, after dinner?" Ryan's response, "Yes. I can't keep living this lie. She deserves to know the truth, even if it destroys her." "Don't feel guilty," Vanessa had replied. "She'll be better off without you. She can go back to her little marketing projects and her art classes and find someone more suited to her simple lifestyle. We're meant for bigger things." I set the phone down carefully, my hands surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Ryan was staring at me with a mixture of guilt and resignation, as if part of him was relieved that the charade was finally over. "How long?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. "Since July," he admitted, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "It wasn't supposed to happen, Natalie. We were just talking about your birthday party, and somehow we started talking about other things, and then you decided my sister was a better option than your wife." Ryan flinched at the coldness in my tone. "It's not that simple. Vanessa and we have things in common that you and I don't. She understands my career ambitions, my goals for the future. She's connected in ways that could help both of us advance professionally." There it was, the truth beneath the lies and justification. This wasn't about love or passion or some irresistible connection. This was about calculation, about networking, about what each person could do for the other's career. Vanessa worked as a senior account executive at one of Denver's top public relations firms, and she'd always been better at playing the corporate politics game than I was. She wore designer suits and attended industry cocktail parties, while I preferred casual clothes and quiet evenings at home. She was ambitious and driven in a way that I'd never been, always focused on climbing the next rung of the professional ladder. So this is about business, I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. You and Vanessa can be the perfect power couple, attending all the right events, knowing all the right people, building your careers together. It's not just about that, Ryan protested, but his words lacked conviction. We genuinely care about each other. We have a real connection. I laughed then, a bitter sound that surprised both of us. A real connection built on lies and betrayal. How romantic. The waiter approached our table tentatively, clearly uncomfortable with the obvious tension, but concerned about the broken glass scattered around my chair. Is everything all right here? Do you need assistance cleaning this up? We're fine, Ryan said quickly, already reaching for his wallet. Just an accident. We'll pay for the damages and get out of your way. But I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. There were too many questions, too many things I needed to understand before I could fully process what was happening to my life. Does my mother know? I asked as Ryan counted out bills with shaking hands. He paused, a $20 bill halfway to the table. What do you mean? Does my mother know about you and Vanessa? Has she been helping you plan this betrayal? The look that crossed Ryan's face told me everything I needed to know. My mother, Patricia Harper, had always preferred Vanessa to me. Where I was quiet and introspective, Vanessa was outgoing and charismatic. Where I was content with my modest position as a marketing coordinator at a small nonprofit, Vanessa had aggressively pursued success in the corporate world. My mother had never hidden her belief that Vanessa was the more accomplished daughter, the one with real potential. She thinks it's for the best, Ryan admitted quietly. She believes that you and I were never really compatible, that we got married too young before we really knew what we wanted. The betrayal felt complete now. Not only had my husband and sister been conducting an affair behind my back, but my own mother had apparently given it her blessing. The three people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally had conspired together to end my marriage and justify their actions as being in my best interest. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The restaurant suddenly felt suffocating, the warm lighting and elegant atmosphere mocking the devastation of my personal life. Other diners were still staring, whispering among themselves about the drama unfolding at table 12. I need to go, I said, gathering my purse and coat with movements that felt robotic and disconnected from my consciousness. Natalie, wait, we need to talk about this properly. We need to figure out the logistics, the house, our finances. Tonight, I turned to face him, and Ryan actually stepped back at whatever he saw in my expression. You want to discuss divorce logistics on our anniversary night, after I just discovered you're leaving me for my sister? I'm sorry, he said, and for the first time that evening, he sounded genuine. I never wanted you to find out like this. I was going to tell you properly, explain everything in a way that might hurt less. There is no way this could hurt less, I replied. But you're right about one thing. We do need to talk about logistics. I'll be staying at Zoe's tonight. We can discuss the practical details tomorrow when I'm not in shock. I turned and walked toward the restaurant's exit, my heels clicking against the marble floor with each step. Behind me, I could hear Ryan calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't bear to look at him again, to see the face of the man I'd loved and trusted for 7 years, knowing that he'd been systematically destroying our life together for months. The October air was sharp against my skin as I stepped outside, and I realized I was shaking, not from the cold but from the adrenaline and shock of having my entire world restructured in the span of 20 minutes. I fumbled for my phone to call a cab, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative. As I waited on the sidewalk outside the Riverside Grill, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the restaurant's windows. The woman staring back at me looked like a stranger. Her emerald dress was still elegant, her makeup still perfectly applied, but there was something hollow in her eyes, something broken that hadn't been there an hour earlier. I thought about all the signs I'd missed or chosen to ignore. Ryan's increased work hours, his new interest in fitness and fashion, the way he'd become more critical of my career choices and social circle. Vanessa's sudden availability to help with our anniversary party planning, her frequent questions about Ryan's work and interests, the way she'd started dressing more provocatively when she came to family dinners, my mother's recent comments about marriage taking work and compromise, her suggestions that maybe Ryan and I should consider couples counseling, her not-so-subtle hints that successful marriages required partners who challenged each other to grow and achieve more. I'd thought she was just being typically critical of my life choices. I never imagined she was laying the groundwork for justifying my husband's affair with my sister. The cab arrived 15 minutes later, and I gave the driver Zoe's address in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. As we pulled away from the restaurant, I saw Ryan emerge from the entrance, looking frantically up and down the street. For a moment our eyes met through the cab's rear window, and I saw genuine anguish in his expression, but it was too late for regret. The damage was done, and there was no going back. Zoe Kim had been my best friend since college, the one person in my life who had never competed with me or made me feel inadequate. She was a graphic designer who ran her own freelance business from her converted warehouse loft in Denver's art district. When she opened her door at 11:30 that night and saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled me inside and made tea while I sat on her couch and stared at nothing. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked finally, settling beside me with 2 steaming mugs. So I told her everything. The anniversary dinner, the phone calls, the text messages, the revelation that my entire family had been complicit in my husband's betrayal. Zoe listened without interruption, her dark eyes growing wider with each detail. "That's unbelievable," she said when I finished. "I mean, I always thought Vanessa was competitive with you, but this is beyond sibling rivalry. This is sociopathic. The worst part is that they all think they're doing me a favor," I said, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Like I'm too naive or simple to understand what's best for my own life. You know that's not true, right?" Zoe's voice was fierce with loyalty. "You're one of the smartest, most capable people I know. Just because you don't play corporate politics games doesn't mean you're simple." I wanted to believe her, but the voices of my mother, sister and husband were loud in my head, all telling me in various ways that I was the problem, that I was holding Ryan back, that I needed to step aside for the greater good of everyone's happiness and success. "Maybe they're right," I said quietly. "Maybe I was never ambitious enough for Ryan. Maybe he needs someone who can match his drive and help him build the kind of life he wants." "Stop," Zoe said firmly. "Don't let them convince you that their betrayal is somehow your fault. You were a loyal, loving wife who supported Ryan's career and dreams. The fact that he chose to throw that away for your sister says everything about his character and nothing about your work." We talked until nearly 3 in the morning, and when Zoe finally convinced me to try to get some sleep, I lay awake on her guest bed, staring at the ceiling, and trying to figure out what came next. My marriage was over, that much was clear. But what would my life look like without Ryan, without the future we'd planned together, without the family support system I'd always taken for granted? I thought about the house we'd bought together, the joint bank accounts, the vacation we'd booked for Christmas, the life insurance policies that listed each other as beneficiaries. There were so many practical details to unravel, so many shared connections that would need to be severed. But underneath all the logistics was a deeper question that I wasn't ready to face yet. Who was I without Ryan? Who was Natalie Harper when she wasn't somebody's wife, somebody's sister, somebody's daughter? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For 7 years, my identity had been shaped by my relationships with other people, my role in their lives, and stories. Now I was going to have to figure out how to exist as just myself, and I wasn't sure I remembered how to do that. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Ryan and 43 text messages. Most of them were apologies and pleas for me to come home, so we could talk properly. A few were practical questions about our shared commitments and responsibilities. The last one, sent at 6:30 in the morning, simply said, "I know you hate me right now, but I hope someday you'll understand that this is better for both of us." I deleted all the messages without responding and turned off my phone. I wasn't ready to face Ryan's version of reality, His justifications and explanations for why destroying our marriage was actually an act of kindness. I needed time to process what had happened and decide how I wanted to handle the practical details of divorce. Zoe made breakfast and coffee, moving quietly around her kitchen while I sat at her dining table and tried to eat. Everything tasted like cardboard, and my stomach rebelled against the idea of food, but I forced myself to swallow a few bites of toast and scrambled eggs. "What do you need today?" Zoe asked, sitting across from me with her own coffee. "Do you want to go back to the house and get some things? Do you need me to make some calls for you?" "I need to call my job and tell them I won't be in today," I said, "and I should probably call a lawyer." The practical tasks felt overwhelming, but they also provided a structure for the day, a way to move forward when everything else felt impossible. Zoe helped me find a divorce attorney who could see me that afternoon, and we spent the morning gathering the financial documents I would need for the consultation. Going back to the house I'd shared with Ryan was surreal. Everything looked exactly the same, from the wedding photos on the mantle to the coffee mug I'd left in the sink the previous morning. But it all felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that Ryan had been living a lie while surrounded by these symbols of our life together. I packed a suitcase with enough clothes and personal items to last a week, avoiding the bedroom where Ryan and I had slept together just 2 nights earlier. As I gathered my things, I found myself looking at our shared possessions with new eyes. The furniture we'd chosen together, the artwork we'd collected on various trips, the books and movies, and small decorative objects that represented 7 years of building a life together. How do you divide a shared history? How do you determine who gets to keep the memory? Ryan wasn't there, which was probably for the best. According to the note he'd left on the kitchen counter, he was staying at his brother's place until we could figure things out properly. The note also included an apology and a promise that he would make the divorce process as easy as possible for me. He wanted to be fair about the division of assets, he said, and he hoped we could remain friends eventually. The casual tone of the note made me angrier than all his text messages combined. How could he write about our divorce like it was a minor inconvenience, something to be handled efficiently and amicably? How could he talk about fairness when he'd been lying to me for months? How could he hope for friendship when he'd betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible? I crumpled up the note and threw it in the trash, then gathered the rest of my things and left the house without looking back. Whatever happened next, I knew I couldn't live in that space anymore. There were too many memories, too many reminders of the woman I'd been when I believed my marriage was real. The consultation with the divorce attorney was straightforward but emotionally exhausting. Margaret Chen was a family law specialist in her 50s, who had clearly handled many cases like mine. She explained the divorce process with professional compassion, outlining timelines and requirements, while also acknowledging the emotional difficulty of what I was going through. "Do you have any reason to suspect there might be hidden assets or financial impropriety?" she asked, reviewing the bank statements and investment documents I'd brought. "I don't think so," I said. "Ryan has always been honest about money. It's just his personal life where he apparently has trouble with the truth." Margaret made notes on her legal pad. "What about the affair? Do you have documented evidence of the relationship between your husband and sister?" I showed her screenshots I'd taken of the text messages on Ryan's phone, feeling sick as I handed over proof of my family's betrayal to a stranger. Margaret reviewed them with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen worse, but I caught a flicker of sympathy in her expression. "This should make the divorce proceeding relatively straightforward," she said. "Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, so we don't need to prove adultery to get a dissolution of marriage, but having this evidence will help if there are any disputes about asset division, or if your husband tries to claim the relationship with your sister began after your separation." We discussed practical matters for another hour. The house would need to be sold and the proceeds divided. Our joint bank accounts would be frozen until the divorce was finalized. I would be entitled to half of our shared assets, including Ryan's retirement accounts and investment portfolio. The process would take at least 6 months, assuming Ryan didn't contest anything. "Do you have somewhere to stay while this plays out?" Margaret asked as our session concluded. "My friend is letting me stay with her temporarily," I said, "but I'll need to find something more permanent soon." "Have you thought about whether you want to stay in Denver?" Sometimes a fresh start in a new city can be helpful after a traumatic divorce. The suggestion surprised me. I'd lived in Denver my entire adult life, built my career here, established friendships and routine. But as I thought about it, I realized that staying would mean constantly running into reminders of my old life. Ryan worked in downtown Denver, Vanessa lived just 20 minutes away. My mother was a fixture in the same social circles I'd always moved in. How could I heal and move forward when everything around me was connected to the people who had destroyed my trust? I hadn't considered leaving, I admitted. But maybe that's not a bad idea. Think about it, Margaret said. You're young, you have marketable skills, and you'll have enough money from the divorce settlement to make a fresh start anywhere you want. Sometimes the best revenge is living well somewhere else. As I left Margaret's office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since reading those text messages. Not hope exactly, but possibility. The future that I'd thought was destroyed might actually be an opportunity. A chance to build something new and better than what I'd lost. For the first time since my world had collapsed, I started to wonder who I might become when I was no longer defined by other people's expectations and limitations. 3 weeks after that devastating anniversary dinner, I stood in the empty living room of what had been our home, watching the moving company load the last of my belongings into their truck. The divorce papers had been filed, the house was officially on the market, and I had made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I was leaving Denver entirely. The idea had started as Margaret's casual suggestion, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Every corner of this city held memories of Ryan. Every restaurant and coffee shop reminded me of dates we'd shared. Every familiar street corner made me wonder if I might run into Vanessa or my mother. I needed space to rebuild my identity without constantly being reminded of who I used to be. Ryan had tried to talk me out of leaving during one of our few face-to-face meetings to discuss the divorce proceedings. We'd met at a neutral coffee shop downtown, both of us awkward and formal with each other in a way that felt completely foreign after 7 years of intimate partnership. "You don't have to run away," he'd said, stirring sugar into his coffee with mechanical precision. "We can make this work. Denver is big enough for both of us." "I'm not running away," I'd replied, keeping my voice steady despite the anger that flared every time I looked at his familiar face. "I'm choosing to start over somewhere that doesn't remind me of the biggest mistake I ever made." Marrying me was a mistake? There had been genuine hurt in his voice, as if he had any right to feel wounded by my words. "No," I'd said quietly. "Trusting you was the mistake." He'd flinched at that, finally looking away from my steady gaze. "Natalie, I know you hate me right now. But someday I hope you'll understand that this whole situation has been difficult for everyone involved. Vanessa and I never meant for it to happen this way." The casual mention of my sister's name had sent a spike of rage through my chest. "Don't," I'd warned him. "Don't you dare sit there and act like you and Vanessa are the victims in this situation. You made choices, Ryan. Both of you made deliberate choices to destroy my marriage and my family." "Your family is still your family," he'd protested. "Your mother loves you, and eventually Vanessa will want to make things right between you two." I'd laughed then, a bitter sound that made the other coffee shop patrons glance in our direction. "My mother orchestrated this betrayal, and my sister has been sleeping with my husband for months. In what universe does that qualify as family love?" Ryan had tried to argue further, insisting that I was being dramatic, and that time would help me see the situation more objective, but I'd stopped listening. His ability to rationalize and justify his actions was exactly why I needed to get as far away from him as possible. As long as I stayed in Denver, I would be subjected to his attempts to rewrite history, to convince me that his affair was somehow an act of kindness rather than the deepest possible betrayal. The decision of where to go had been surprisingly easy. Portland, Oregon had always intrigued me during business trips I'd taken with the nonprofit where I worked. The city had a thriving creative community, a strong job market for marketing professionals, and most importantly, no connections to my old life. I could disappear into anonymity there, rebuild myself from scratch without anyone knowing my history or feeling sorry for the woman whose husband had left her for her sister. Zoe had been supportive, but worried about my decision to move so far away. "Are you sure you're not just trying to escape your problems?" she'd asked as we packed my belongings into boxes. "Because your problems have a way of following you, no matter where you go." "I'm not trying to escape my problems," I'd explained, carefully wrapping a ceramic vase that had been a wedding gift from Ryan's grandmother. "I'm trying to escape other people's versions of my problems. Here, I'll always be poor Natalie whose husband cheated with her sister. In Portland, I can just be Natalie." The logistics of relocating had been surprisingly complex. I'd had to resign from my job at Mile High Community Foundation, where I'd worked as their marketing coordinator for the past 4 years. My supervisor, Helen Rodriguez, had been understanding but disappointed to lose me. "You've built something really valuable here," she'd said during my exit interview. "The donor engagement campaigns you've developed have increased our fundraising by 30% over the past 2 years. Are you sure there's nothing we can do to convince you to stay?" It was gratifying to hear that my work had been appreciated and effective, especially after months of feeling like I was inadequate in every aspect of my life. "I appreciate everything this organization has taught me," I'd reply, "but I need a complete fresh start right now." Helen had nodded with the understanding of someone who had clearly been through her own share of life upheavals. "Well, you have my highest recommendation wherever you end up, and if you ever decide to come back to Denver, we'd love to have you." Finding a new job in Portland had required weeks of online applications and video interviews, but eventually I'd landed a position as marketing manager at Cascade Environmental Alliance, a nonprofit focused on protecting Oregon's wilderness area. The job paid slightly more than my Denver position, and came with the kind of mission-driven work that had always motivated me most. The apartment hunting had been done entirely through virtual tours and video calls with leasing agents, a leap of faith that would have terrified the old Natalie, but felt liberating to the new version of myself I was trying to become. I'd settled on a one-bedroom loft in the Pearl District, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls and large windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was completely different from the suburban house I'd shared with Ryan, modern and minimalist, where our old home had been traditional and cluttered with accumulated memories. My mother had been predictably dramatic about my decision to leave Colorado. She'd shown up at Zoe's apartment unannounced 3 days before my scheduled departure, dressed in her usual armor of expensive clothes and careful makeup, her silver hair styled in the same elegant bob she'd worn for the past decade. "This is absolutely ridiculous, Natalie," she'd announced, settling herself on Zoe's couch, as if she'd been invited, running away to Oregon like some kind of hippie refugee. "What exactly do you think you're accomplishing with this melodramatic gesture?" "I'm accomplishing distance from people who think betraying me was in my best interest," I'd replied, continuing to fold clothes into my suitcase while she watched with obvious disapproval. "Oh, please, you're being overly sensitive about a situation that adults should be able to handle with maturity and grace. Ryan and Vanessa fell in love. It happens. The dignified thing to do would be to accept the situation and find a way to maintain family relationship." The casual dismissal of my pain had been so characteristic of my mother that I'd almost laughed. Patricia Harper had always been more concerned with appearances and social expectations than with the actual feelings of her daughter. Growing up, she'd consistently prioritized Vanessa's achievements and social success while treating my quieter, more introspective nature as a character flaw to be corrected. "You want to know what would be dignified?" I'd asked, finally turning to face her directly. "A mother who supports her daughter through the worst betrayal of her life instead of congratulating the people who caused it." "I never congratulated anyone," she'd protested, but her tone lacked conviction. "You gave your blessing to Ryan's affair with Vanessa. You told him it was for the best. You've been actively working against your own daughter's marriage for months." My mother had shifted uncomfortably, her carefully composed expression flickering for just a moment. "I simply recognized that you and Ryan weren't well suited for the long term. Vanessa has always been more ambitious, more socially adept. She can help Ryan build the kind of life he wants." "And what about the kind of life I want?" Did that ever factor into your calculation? She'd looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if the idea that I might have my own dreams and ambitions had never occurred to her. You've always been content with simple things, dear. Your little art projects and your nonprofit work. You don't need the kind of high-powered lifestyle that Ryan and Vanessa are building together. The conversation had continued for another painful hour, with my mother alternating between attempts to convince me that staying in Denver was the mature choice, and criticisms of my decision to abandon my family during a difficult time. By the time she left, I was more certain than ever that leaving Colorado was the right decision. Vanessa had made no attempt to contact me directly, but I'd heard through mutual friends that she and Ryan had moved in together within 2 weeks of our separation. They'd apparently made their relationship official on social media, posting photos of romantic dinners and weekend getaways, with the kind of shameless confidence that suggested they felt no guilt about the circumstances of their coupling. The night before I left Denver, Zoe and I had dinner at our favorite Thai restaurant, a modest place in the University District where we'd been regular customers for years. The familiar surroundings and comfort food felt like the perfect way to say goodbye to the life I was leaving behind. "I'm going to miss you so much," Zoe said, picking at her pad thai with uncharacteristic lack of appetite. Zoe had been the one constant source of support and understanding throughout the divorce proceedings, the one person who had never questioned my decisions or tried to convince me to forgive and forget. "And I promise I'll come back to visit once I'm settled." "What if you hate Portland? What if the job doesn't work out, or you can't make friends, or you just feel completely lost?" I'd considered her questions seriously, because they were all possibilities that had occurred to me during sleepless nights over the past month. "Then I'll figure something else out," I'd said finally. "But at least I'll be figuring it out on my own terms, without everyone in my life having opinions about what's best for me." The drive to Portland had taken 2 days, with an overnight stop in Boise that felt like crossing into a completely different world. As I'd driven west through the changing landscape, watching the Colorado mountains give way to Idaho plains, and eventually to Oregon's green forests, I'd felt something loosening in my chest. Every mile between myself and Denver was a mile away from the wreckage of my old life. My first week in Portland had been a blur of unpacking, grocery shopping, and trying to navigate a new city while adjusting to my job at Cascade Environmental Alliance. The work itself was fascinating and challenging in ways that energized me. Instead of writing grant applications and donor newsletters for a small urban nonprofit, I was developing comprehensive marketing campaigns for wilderness conservation efforts across the entire Pacific Northwest. My new supervisor, Marcus Thompson, was a former journalist who had transitioned into nonprofit communications after burning out on political reporting. He was 10 years older than me, with the kind of calm, thoughtful demeanor that made everyone around him feel more capable and confident. "Your background with donor engagement is exactly what we need," he'd told me during my first week orientation. "We're great at the conservation work, but we've never been particularly good at telling our story in ways that motivate people to get involved." The challenge was exactly what I needed to distract myself from the emotional aftermath of my divorce. I threw myself into learning about Oregon's environmental issues, studying the complex relationships between logging interests, recreation advocates, and conservation groups. For the first time in months, I had work that engaged my brain completely, leaving little mental space for dwelling on Ryan's betrayal or my family's dysfunction. My colleagues at Cascade were a mix of passionate environmentalists and communication professionals, most of them in their 30s and 40s, with the kind of casual, outdoorsy lifestyle that seemed uniquely Pacific Northwest. They welcomed me with friendly curiosity but without the invasive personal questions I'd dreaded. In Portland, being a recent divorcee from Colorado was unremarkable enough that no one felt compelled to dig deeper into my story. The apartment in the Pearl District was slowly becoming home, as I filled it with furniture and belongings that reflected my own taste rather than compromises with a spouse. I'd bought a vintage leather couch from a local antique store, hung local artwork on the exposed brick walls, and filled the large windows with plants that thrived in Portland's abundant natural light. Living alone for the first time in 7 years was initially disorienting but increasingly liberating. I could eat cereal for dinner without judgment, stay up late, reading without disturbing anyone, play music as loud as I wanted while cleaning the apartment. Small freedoms that I'd forgotten, I'd given up during my marriage. My evenings were spent exploring the city, discovering coffee shops and bookstores and restaurants that might become new favorites. Portland's food scene was a revelation after Denver's more limited options, and I found myself trying cuisines and flavors that Ryan had never been interested in exploring. It was a small thing, but ordering Korean barbecue or Ethiopian injera felt like acts of rebellion against the constrained version of myself I'd become during my marriage. 3 months into my Portland life, I received an unexpected email from Ryan. The subject line simply read, "Checking in," and I'd stared at it for several minutes before deciding to open it. "Hi Natalie," the message began. "I hope you're settling in well in Portland. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that the divorce papers are almost finalized, and you should receive your settlement check within the next few weeks. I also wanted to tell you that I've been thinking a lot about our conversation at the coffee shop, and I think you were right about needing space to figure out who you are on your own. I hope you're finding what you're looking for." The email had continued with updates about mutual friends and casual observations about Denver, as if we were former college roommates catching up rather than ex-spouses whose marriage had ended in devastating betrayal. The tone was friendly but distant, suggesting that Ryan had fully moved on from our relationship, and was reaching out more from politeness than any genuine emotional connection. I'd deleted the email without responding, but it had stirred up emotions I thought I'd successfully buried. Not longing for Ryan or regret about leaving Denver, but a strange mixture of anger and sadness about how thoroughly he'd rewritten our history. In his version of events, we were simply two people who had grown apart and moved on to more suitable partners. The betrayal, the lies, the months of deception had been edited out of his narrative completely. That night, I'd called Zoe and ended up crying for the first time since moving to Portland. Not because I missed Ryan or wanted him back, but because I was grieving the loss of the relationship I'd thought we had, the partnership I'd believed was real even though it had apparently been an illusion for months before its official end. "He's rewriting history to make himself feel better," Zoe had said with characteristic bluntness. "That's what people do when they can't handle the reality of their own actions." "I know that, intellectually," I'd replied, "but part of me wonders if I'm the one remembering things wrong. Maybe our marriage really was as flawed as he claims. Maybe I was holding him back without realizing it." "Stop," Zoe had interrupted firmly. "I watched you two together for 5 years. You supported his career. You accommodated his social schedule. You moved across the country when he got that promotion. You were a devoted partner who deserved better than betrayal." The conversation had helped restore my perspective, reminding me that my version of events was just as valid as Ryan's. Probably more so since I hadn't spent months lying and manipulating to justify my actions. But it had also clarified something important about my healing process. I needed to stop defining myself in relation to Ryan and my marriage, stop measuring my progress by how much I missed him, or how angry I still felt about his betrayal. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a work project 6 months after moving to Portland. Cascade Environmental Alliance had been approached by a major outdoor gear company about a potential partnership to fund wilderness education programs. The company, Pacific Summit Outfitters, was looking to align their brand with authentic conservation efforts, rather than the superficial greenwashing that characterized many corporate environmental initiatives. I'd been assigned to develop the partnership proposal, which required extensive research into the company's history, values, and business practices. What I discovered was a family-owned business that had been founded by environmental advocates and maintained a genuine commitment to protecting the landscapes that inspired their products. The company's founder and current CEO was Gabriel Martinez, a former wilderness guide who had built Pacific Summit from a small climbing gear shop into a nationally recognized brand, while maintaining rigorous environmental standards. Reading about his business philosophy and conservation work, I'd found myself genuinely excited about the potential partnership in a way that had nothing to do with professional obligation. My first meeting with Gabriel and his marketing team was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Pacific Summit's headquarters in the industrial Southeast District of Portland. I'd prepared extensively, developing a comprehensive presentation that outlined potential collaboration opportunities and measurable impact metrics. Gabriel Martinez was not what I'd expected from a successful CEO. Instead of the polished corporate executive I'd imagined, He was a lean, athletic man in his late 30s, with sun-weathered skin and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt rather than a business suit, and his office was decorated with vintage climbing gear and photographs of mountain landscapes rather than corporate awards and diplomas. "Miss Harper," he'd said, standing to shake my hand as his assistant introduced me. "Thank you for coming in. I've reviewed your initial proposal, and I'm impressed by the depth of research you've done into our company values." His handshake was firm and calloused, the hands of someone who spent significant time outdoors rather than behind a desk. There was something immediately trustworthy about his demeanor, a sense that he was genuinely interested in the conversation rather than simply going through professional motion. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours as we discussed potential partnership structures, funding mechanisms, and program goals. Gabriel asked thoughtful questions about Cascade's conservation work and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the challenges facing wilderness protection efforts. His marketing team contributed valuable insights about reaching outdoor enthusiast demographics while maintaining authentic messaging. "What drew you to conservation work?" Gabriel asked toward the end of our meeting, his question directed specifically to me rather than the general group. "I grew up hiking and camping in Colorado," I'd replied, surprised by the personal nature of his inquiry. "I think I always took those landscapes for granted until I started working in environmental protection and learned how fragile and threatened they really are." "Colorado has some incredible wilderness areas," he'd said with genuine enthusiasm. "I've done extensive climbing in the Rockies. What brought you to Portland?" The question was casual and friendly, but it touched on the complicated reality of my recent life changes. "I needed a fresh start," I'd answered honestly. "Sometimes you have to completely change your environment to figure out who you really are." Gabriel had nodded with understanding, and I'd sensed that he was someone who appreciated the courage required to reinvent yourself. "Well, Portland is a good place for fresh starts. The city has a way of letting people become whoever they want to be." As the meeting concluded and we shook hands again, Gabriel had made a comment that stayed with me for the rest of the day. "I hope we can make this partnership work," he'd said. "It's refreshing to meet someone who clearly cares about the mission behind the marketing." Walking back to my car after the meeting, I'd realized that I felt energized and engaged in a way that had been missing from my life for months. The conversation with Gabriel and his team had reminded me that I was good at my work, that I had valuable skills and insights that could make a real difference in causes I cared about. More than that, Gabriel's genuine interest in my background and motivations had made me feel seen and appreciated as a professional for the first time since leaving Denver. There had been no condescension or dismissal, no suggestion that my career was somehow less important than more traditionally ambitious paths. That evening, I drafted a follow-up email to Gabriel outlining additional partnership ideas that had occurred to me during our conversation. As I wrote, I'd found myself crafting each sentence carefully, wanting to strike the right balance between professional competence and personal engagement. His response came the next morning, equally thoughtful and detailed, suggesting that he had given our conversation serious consideration. "Your ideas about connecting conservation education with experiential outdoor programs are exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need," he'd written. "Would you be interested in visiting one of our partner wilderness sites to see the kind of programming we currently support?" The invitation felt like both a professional opportunity and a personal challenge. The old Natalie might have hesitated, worried about overstepping boundaries or appearing too eager, but the new version of myself that was emerging in Portland felt capable of accepting opportunities without second-guessing my worthiness. "I'd be very interested," I'd replied. "When would be convenient?" His response suggested a weekend trip to a wilderness education camp in the Cascade Mountains, where Pacific Summit was currently funding environmental education programs for urban youth. The trip would involve camping and hiking, he'd warned, and required a moderate level of physical fitness. I'd accepted immediately, then spent the rest of the week wondering what I'd gotten myself into. It had been years since I'd done any serious outdoor activities. Ryan had never been particularly interested in camping or hiking, preferring city vacations and resort destinations. But something about Gabriel's invitation felt like an opportunity to reconnect with a part of myself that I'd neglected during my marriage. The weekend trip turned out to be transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. Gabriel picked me up early Saturday morning in a well-worn pickup truck loaded with camping gear and supplies for the weekend. The drive to the mountains took 2 hours through increasingly spectacular scenery, and our conversation ranged from environmental policy to personal travel experiences, to favorite books and music. "What's the most adventurous thing you've ever done?" Gabriel asked as we wound through a particularly dramatic stretch of mountain highway. I'd thought about the question seriously, realizing that most of my adult adventures had been relatively tame and carefully planned. "Probably moving to Portland without knowing anyone or having a place to live," I'd answered finally. 6 months ago that felt like jumping off a cliff. "What made you take that particular leap?" It was a more complex question than he probably realized, touching on all the painful circumstances that had led to my cross-country relocation. "My life in Denver had become something I didn't recognize," I'd said carefully. "I needed to find out who I was when I wasn't trying to be who other people wanted me to be." Gabriel had glanced at me with an expression that suggested he understood the feeling. "That's actually quite adventurous," he'd said. "Most people spend their whole lives trying to meet other people's expectations instead of figuring out their own." The wilderness camp was a collection of rustic cabins and outdoor classroom spaces, nestled in a valley surrounded by old-growth forest. The program served teenagers from Portland's urban core, many of whom had never experienced wilderness settings before participating in the camp's week-long session. Watching Gabriel interact with the camp staff and participants, I'd been struck by his genuine enthusiasm for the educational mission and his ability to connect with people across age and background differences. He wasn't performing the role of generous CEO. He was clearly someone who found deep personal satisfaction in supporting conservation education. "The goal isn't just to teach them about ecosystems and wildlife," he'd explained as we observed a group of teenagers learning to identify native plant species. "It's to help them understand that they're connected to these landscapes, that protecting wilderness isn't about preserving something separate from their lives, but about maintaining the foundation that all life depends on." That evening, as we sat around a campfire with the camp staff sharing stories and roasted marshmallows, I'd felt more relaxed and authentic than I had in years. The combination of mountain air, physical activity, and meaningful conversation was exactly what I hadn't known I was craving. "You seem different out here," Gabriel had observed as we walked back to our respective cabins after the fire had died down. "Different how?" "More yourself, somehow. Like you're not performing a role or trying to manage other people's impressions." His comment had surprised me with its perceptiveness. I guess I spent a lot of years trying to be the kind of person I thought I should be instead of figuring out who I actually was. "And who are you actually?" It was a profound question delivered with casual friendliness, but it made me realize that I was still in the process of discovering the answer. "I'm still figuring that out," I'd admitted, "but I think she's someone who belongs in places like this." The next morning, Gabriel had suggested we hike to a nearby waterfall before heading back to Portland. The trail was moderately challenging, winding through dense forest and crossing several streams on fallen logs and rocky fords. I'd been nervous about keeping up, but found myself energized by the physical challenge and spectacular scenery. "You're a natural hiker," Gabriel had said as we paused to rest beside the waterfall, the sound of cascading water creating a peaceful backdrop for conversation. "I used to hike a lot when I was younger," I'd replied, remembering weekend camping trips with college friends and family vacations in Colorado's national parks. I'd forgotten how much I missed it. "What stopped you?" The honest answer was that Ryan had never enjoyed hiking, and I'd gradually given up activities he didn't want to share, but explaining that would have required details about my marriage and divorce that I wasn't ready to discuss with someone I'd just met. "Life got complicated," I'd said instead. "Work and responsibilities and just the general business of adult life." Gabriel had nodded with understanding, but I'd sensed that he was someone who had made deliberate choices to prioritize the activities and experiences that mattered most to him. There was something inspiring about his commitment to maintaining balance between professional success and personal fulfillment. The drive back to Portland had felt too short, our conversation covering everything from travel dreams to favorite restaurants to books that had influenced our thinking about environmental issues. By the time Gabriel dropped me off at my apartment, I'd realized that I was attracted to him in a way that had nothing to do with filling the void left by my divorce and everything to do with genuine compatibility and shared value. "Thank you for the weekend," I'd said as we stood beside his truck outside my building. It was exactly what I needed without knowing I needed it. "Thank you for coming," he'd reply. "Your insights about connecting urban communities with wilderness experiences are going to be invaluable for developing our partnership program." There had been a moment of hesitation as we said goodbye, a sense that both of us wanted to extend the conversation but weren't sure how to navigate the professional-personal boundary. Finally, Gabriel had reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "This has my personal number on it," he'd said. "If you ever want to explore more of Oregon's wilderness areas, I'd be happy to be your hiking guide." The invitation was carefully neutral, offering friendship and outdoor adventure without any pressure for romantic involvement. But as I'd taken the card and felt the brief contact of our fingers, I'd sensed that there was potential for something deeper if we both chose to pursue it. That night, I'd sat in my apartment, reviewing the weekend's experiences and marveling at how different I felt from the broken, angry woman who had fled Denver 6 months early. Gabriel's interest in my ideas and perspectives had reminded me that I was capable of engaging with life as an equal partner rather than someone who needed to be rescued or managed. More importantly, his example of building a successful business while maintaining personal integrity and environmental values had shown me a different model of professional achievement than the climbing the corporate ladder mentality that had always felt foreign to my nature. For the first time since my divorce, I was beginning to envision a future that felt genuinely exciting rather than simply safe or practical. A future where my work aligned with my values, where my personal relationships were based on mutual respect and shared interests, where I could be authentically myself without apology or compromise. The partnership between Cascade Environmental Alliance and Pacific Summit Outfitters was approved 2 weeks later, launching what would become one of the most successful conservation education programs in the Pacific Northwest. But more than professional success, the collaboration had introduced me to possibilities I hadn't known existed for combining meaningful work with personal fulfillment and authentic relationships. 2 years had passed since that first camping trip with Gabriel, and my life in Portland had evolved into something I barely recognized from my Denver days. The partnership between Cascade Environmental Alliance and Pacific Summit Outfitters had expanded beyond our wildest initial projections, creating a network of wilderness education programs that served over 3,000 young people annually across Oregon and Washington. My role had evolved as well. What started as a marketing manager position had grown into director of strategic partnerships, overseeing collaborations with dozens of outdoor companies, educational institutions, and government agencies. The work challenged me in ways I'd never experienced, requiring me to think strategically about large-scale conservation efforts, while managing complex relationships between diverse stakeholders. Gabriel and I had been married for 8 months now, a small ceremony at Crater Lake, attended only by close friends and his immediate family. The contrast with my elaborate Denver wedding couldn't have been more pronounced. Where my first wedding had been about meeting expectations and creating the perfect social media moments, marrying Gabriel felt like a natural evolution of a partnership that had been growing stronger for over a year. Our relationship had developed slowly and organically, built on shared outdoor adventures, late-night conversations about environmental policy, and a mutual respect for each other's professional ambition. Gabriel never made me feel like I needed to choose between career success and personal happiness. Instead, he actively supported my professional growth, while building his own company into a nationally recognized leader in sustainable outdoor gear manufacturing. Pacific Summit Outfitters had just completed its acquisition of 2 smaller outdoor companies, expanding their product line into sustainable camping equipment and eco-friendly hiking apparel. The acquisition had been Gabriel's strategic response to increased consumer demand for environmentally responsible outdoor gear, and it had positioned the company for significant growth over the next 5 years. The success had brought unexpected opportunities and challenge. Gabriel was increasingly invited to speak at industry conferences and environmental summits, while I was being courted by larger organizations, looking for someone with my track record in partnership development. A month earlier, I'd received a particularly intriguing offer from the National Wilderness Coalition, a Washington, D.C.-based organization that coordinated conservation efforts across federal agencies and major environmental groups. It would be an incredible opportunity, I'd told Gabriel as we hiked through the Columbia River Gorge one Saturday morning, discussing the job offer that had been weighing on my mind for weeks. The scope of influence would be massive, working on policy that affects wilderness areas across the entire country. But, Gabriel had prompted, sensing my hesitation, but it would mean leaving Portland, leaving the work we've built together. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to go back to the East Coast political environment. Gabriel had stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious but supportive. Natalie, if this is the right opportunity for your career, we'll figure out how to make it work. I don't want you turning down your dream job because of geography. His willingness to consider relocating his entire business operation for my career advancement was exactly the kind of partnership I'd never experienced in my marriage to Ryan. Gabriel saw my professional success as equally important to his own, never suggesting that I should compromise my ambitions for the sake of our relationship. What if I don't want the DC job? I'd asked, realizing as I spoke that I was leaning toward staying in Portland. What if I think we can build something even more impactful here? Gabriel's smile had been immediate and genuine. Then I think you should trust your instincts. You've never been wrong about strategic decisions yet. That conversation had crystallized something important about the direction I wanted my career to take. Instead of accepting the National Wilderness Coalition position, I'd started developing a proposal for creating an independent consulting firm that would specialize in developing corporate environmental partnerships on a national scale. The idea was ambitious, but grounded in the successful model Gabriel and I had built together in the Pacific Northwest. Rather than working within the constraints of a single organization, I would have the flexibility to broker partnerships between outdoor companies and conservation groups across the country, leveraging the credibility I'd established through the Pacific Summit collaboration. Gabriel had been enthusiastic about the concept from the moment I'd outlined it over dinner one evening. You could revolutionize how environmental organizations approach corporate partnerships, he'd said, his excitement building as we'd discussed the possibility. Most nonprofits are still approaching companies with their hands out asking for donations. You're talking about creating genuine business partnerships that benefit both sides. The consulting firm, which I'd decided to call Summit Conservation Partners, would launch with Pacific Summit as its founding client, but with the explicit goal of expanding to work with outdoor companies nationwide. I'd already identified potential partners in Colorado, Utah, California, and New England, companies whose values aligned with environmental protection, but who lacked the expertise to develop effective conservation programs. Setting up the business had required months of legal consultations, financial planning, and strategic networking. Gabriel had connected me with the lawyers and accountants who had helped him grow Pacific Summit, while I'd leveraged my conservation network to identify potential clients and collaborators. The launch strategy was aggressive but carefully planned. Summit Conservation Partners would debut at the Outdoor Industry Summit in Denver, a major trade conference that brought together outdoor gear manufacturers, retailers, and environmental organizations from across North America. I would be presenting a keynote address about innovative corporate environmental partnerships, using the Pacific Summit model as a case study for what was possible when businesses committed to authentic environmental stewardship. The irony of returning to Denver for such a significant professional milestone wasn't lost on me. 3 years after fleeing the city as a heartbroken divorcee, I would be returning as a successful entrepreneur, launching a business that had the potential to influence conservation efforts nationwide. "Are you nervous about going back?" Gabriel had asked, as we'd prepared for the conference trip. "Not nervous exactly," I'd replied, considering the question seriously, more curious than anything else. "I want to see how it feels to be there as someone completely different from who I was when I left." The flight to Denver had been surprisingly emotional. As the plane descended through familiar mountain ranges and I caught sight of the skyline I'd once called home, I'd felt a mixture of nostalgia and pride. This was where my adult life had begun, where I'd learned important lessons about trust and betrayal, where I'd discovered the strength to completely reinvent myself. Gabriel had squeezed my hand as we'd walked through Denver International Airport, his steady presence grounding me in the present, rather than allowing me to spiral into memories of my former life. "You ready for this?" he'd asked. "More than ready," I'd replied, and meant it completely. The Outdoor Industry Summit was being held at the Colorado Convention Center, a massive facility downtown that I'd driven past countless times during my years in the city but had never entered. The conference brought together over 5,000 attendees, from startup gear designers to executives from major outdoor corporations, all focused on the intersection of business and environmental responsibility. My keynote presentation was scheduled for the second day of the conference, giving me time to attend other sessions and network with potential clients. Walking through the exhibition hall, I'd been amazed by the innovation and environmental consciousness that had emerged in the outdoor industry over the past few years. Companies were showcasing gear made from recycled materials, carbon-neutral manufacturing processes, and supply chains that supported conservation efforts in the communities where products were sourced. Natalie Martina, the voice behind me, had been familiar but unexpected, causing me to turn around with a sense of foreboding that proved immediately justified. Ryan stood about 10 feet away, looking exactly as I remembered but somehow smaller than my memories had suggested. He was wearing a expensive suit that marked him as successful in his field, but there was something defeated in his posture that surprised me. "Hello, Ryan," I'd replied evenly, grateful that Gabriel was beside me to witness this unexpected encounter. "I heard you were speaking at the conference." I couldn't believe it when I saw your name in the program. Ryan's eyes had darted between Gabriel and me, clearly trying to assess the nature of our relationship. "You look incredible. Portland obviously agrees with you." "Thank you," I'd said simply, offering no additional information about my life or circumstances. The awkward silence had stretched for several moments before Ryan had continued. "I've been following your work with the environmental partnerships. Pretty impressive stuff. Much more ambitious than anything you were doing in Denver." There had been something patronizing in his tone, as if my current success was surprising given his assessment of my capabilities. Gabriel had tensed beside me, clearly picking up on the subtle condescension. "Natalie has revolutionized how outdoor companies approach conservation partnerships," Gabriel had said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "The programs she's developed are being studied as models for corporate environmental responsibility nation." Ryan had looked at Gabriel with renewed interest, apparently reassessing the situation. "And you are Gabriel Martinez," Gabriel had replied, extending his hand for a brief professional handshake. "Natalie's husband and CEO of Pacific Summit Outfitter." The shock on Ryan's face had been immediate and unmistakable. Clearly he'd assumed that I was still struggling to rebuild my life after our divorce, perhaps dating casually but certainly not remarried to someone successful in his own right. "Congratulations," Ryan had managed, though his smile looked forced. "When did you two get married?" 8 months ago, I'd replied, allowing myself to enjoy his obvious discomfort. "We've been partners in business and life for over 2 years now." "Partners in business?" Ryan's confusion had been evident. "Gabriel was my first major client when I started developing corporate conservation partnerships," I'd explained. "Our professional collaboration evolved into something personal over time." The conversation had continued for another few uncomfortable minutes, with Ryan asking increasingly personal questions that I'd deflected with polite but minimal responses. Finally, Gabriel had excused us to attend a session on sustainable supply chain management, effectively ending the encounter. "Well, that was interesting," Gabriel had commented as we'd walked away. "Not exactly how I imagined meeting your ex-husband." "I'm sorry about that," I'd said, feeling oddly protective of Gabriel despite his obvious ability to handle himself in any situation. "I never expected to run into him here." "Don't apologize. It was actually enlightening to see you in that context. You handled it with remarkable grace and dignity." That evening, the conference had hosted a networking reception at the Denver Art Museum, a venue that had particular significance for me since I'd volunteered there during my marriage to Ryan. Walking through the familiar galleries with Gabriel pointing out pieces I remembered from my docent training had felt like closing a circle in my personal history. "You should consider adding arts partnerships to your consulting portfolio," Gabriel had suggested as we'd admired a contemporary sculpture installation. "There's a growing movement toward environmental art and cultural institutions supporting conservation efforts." His suggestion had sparked an entirely new direction for Summit conservation partners that I hadn't previously considered. Arts organizations were increasingly interested in environmental themes, and many had physical spaces that could showcase conservation messages to diverse urban audiences. "That's brilliant," I'd said, already envisioning partnerships between outdoor companies and museums, galleries, and performing arts centers. We could create programs that bring environmental education into cultural spaces where people might not otherwise encounter conservation messages. The reception had been productive beyond my expectations, with several major outdoor companies expressing interest in consulting services and multiple nonprofit organizations asking about partnership opportunities. By the end of the evening, I'd collected enough business cards and contact information to keep me busy with follow-up conversations for months. My keynote presentation, the next morning, had gone better than I'd dared to hope. The audience of industry executives and environmental advocates had been engaged and responsive, asking thoughtful questions about scaling corporate conservation partnerships and measuring environmental impact alongside business outcomes. The future of environmental protection depends on moving beyond the traditional model of nonprofits asking corporations for charity. I'd concluded my presentation. Instead, we need to create genuine business partnerships where environmental stewardship becomes a competitive advantage rather than a cost center. The response had been immediate and enthusiastic, with a standing ovation that had surprised me with its duration and intensity. As I'd left the stage, I'd caught sight of Ryan in the audience, his expression unreadable but clearly thoughtful. The conference concluded with an awards ceremony, recognizing innovation in sustainable business practices. Pacific Summit Outfitters had been nominated for their supply chain transparency initiative, but Gabriel and I had been shocked when they'd also announced a special recognition award for Summit Conservation Partners' work in developing the outdoor industry's first comprehensive corporate conservation partnership model. Walking onto the stage to accept the award, with Gabriel beside me and an audience of industry leaders applauding our work, had felt like the culmination of everything I'd been building towards since leaving Denver. Not revenge against the people who had hurt me, but proof that I'd been capable of much more than they'd ever imagined. After the ceremony, Ryan had approached us again, this time with a humility that had been absent from our previous encounter. "Congratulations on the award," he'd said, his tone genuine rather than patronizing. "I owe you an apology, Natalie. When we divorced, I convinced myself that you would be better off without me, that I was freeing you to find someone more suited to your quiet lifestyle. I clearly underestimated what you were capable of achieving. You underestimated what I was capable of becoming when I was supported rather than constrained," I'd corrected gently. "There's a difference." Ryan had nodded, looking genuinely chagrined. "Vanessa and I got divorced last year," he'd said quietly. "It turns out that relationships built on ambition and convenience don't last when the circumstances change." The news had surprised me, though I'd realized that I felt no satisfaction in learning about their failed marriage. If anything, I felt sorry for both of them, trapped in a relationship that had been more about calculation than genuine compatibility. "I'm sorry to hear that," I'd said, and meant it. "I hope you both find what you're really looking for." I think what I was really looking for was someone who believed in me the way Gabriel obviously believes in you, Ryan had replied, glancing at Gabriel with something that looked like envy. I was too immature to appreciate that when I had. The conversation had ended with a handshake and mutual wishes for future happiness, a closure that felt surprisingly healing despite the years of pain that had preceded it. As Gabriel and I had walked away, I'd realized that I felt lighter somehow, as if encountering Ryan as a successful, confident woman had finally put our relationship into proper perspective. The flight back to Portland had been celebratory, with Gabriel and me discussing the new business opportunities that had emerged from the conference and planning how to handle the increased demand for Summit Conservation Partners services. "You're going to need to hire staff," Gabriel had observed as we'd reviewed my list of potential new clients. "This is growing beyond what one person can manage, even someone as capable as you." "I've been thinking about that," I'd replied, "but I want to be careful about expansion. I don't want to lose the personal touch that makes these partnerships work." "What if you brought in partners rather than employees? People with complementary skills who could share ownership and responsibility for different aspects of the business?" The suggestion had immediate appeal. Summit Conservation Partners was successful precisely because it combined environmental expertise with business acumen and relationship-building skill. Bringing in partners with specialized knowledge could expand our capabilities while maintaining the collaborative approach that differentiated us from larger consulting firms. Over the following weeks, Gabriel and I had identified potential partners who could strengthen different aspects of the business. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a former National Park Service ecologist, could bring scientific credibility and policy expertise. James Chen, who had spent a decade in corporate sustainability roles at major outdoor companies, could provide insider knowledge of how large corporations made partnership decisions. Both Elena and James had expressed interest in joining Summit Conservation Partners as equity partners, excited by the opportunity to build something new while working on meaningful environmental protection efforts. The partnership expansion had moved quickly once we'd committed to the direction. Within 3 months, Summit Conservation Partners had grown from a solo consulting practice to a 4-person firm with offices in Portland and satellite locations in Boulder and San Francisco. Our client roster had expanded to include 12 major outdoor companies and partnerships with conservation organizations across the western United States. The revenue growth had exceeded even Gabriel's optimistic projections, establishing Summit Conservation Partners as the leading consulting firm specializing in corporate environmental partnerships. More importantly, the environmental impact of our work was becoming measurable and significant. The companies we worked with had collectively committed to protecting over 200,000 acres of wilderness, funding environmental education programs that reached 50,000 young people annually, and adopting manufacturing practices that reduced their collective carbon footprint by 30%. "You've created something remarkable," Gabriel had told me one evening as we'd reviewed our year-end impact report. "5 years ago, you were a marketing coordinator at a small nonprofit. Now you're influencing conservation policy and corporate practices across the entire outdoor industry." His observation had made me reflect on the transformation that had brought me to this point. The woman who had discovered her husband's affair through text messages on an anniversary dinner table seemed like a different person entirely, someone whose dreams and ambitions had been constrained by other people's expectations and limitations. "I couldn't have done any of this if you hadn't seen possibilities in me that I didn't know existed," I'd replied, grateful beyond words for Gabriel's unwavering support and partnership. "I didn't create your capabilities," Gabriel had corrected. "I just recognized them and provided a platform for you to demonstrate what you could accomplish when you believed in yourself." As we'd sat together in our Portland home, surrounded by the evidence of our professional and personal success, I'd felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path that had led me here. The betrayal that had destroyed my first marriage had ultimately freed me to discover who I really was and what I was capable of achieving. Tomorrow we would be flying to Washington for meetings with several major environmental organizations interested in expanding our partnership model to the East Coast. It would be another milestone in Summit Conservation Partners' growth, and potentially the beginning of national influence for our approach to corporate environmental stewardship. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly where I was, with a partner who supported my ambitions and a career that aligned with my deepest values. The future felt full of possibilities that I was confident in my ability to pursue and achieve. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by certified mail to Summit Conservation Partners' Portland headquarters. The return address made my hands tremble as I held the elegant cream-colored envelope. Harper Family Trust, Denver, Colorado. I recognized my mother's distinctive handwriting on the address label, though I hadn't received any communication from her in over 3 years. Gabriel found me in my office staring at the unopened envelope, clearly wrestling with whether to read whatever message it contained. He'd learned to read my moods with remarkable accuracy during our years together, and the expression on my face must have conveyed the significance of what I was holding. "Bad news?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk with the coffee he'd brought me from the kitchen. "I don't know yet," I replied, turning the envelope over in my hands. "It's from my mother, the first contact I've had with my family since I left Denver." Gabriel's expression grew serious. He knew the full story of my family's betrayal, the painful details of how my mother had encouraged Ryan's affair with Vanessa, but he'd never pushed me to reconcile or attempt to repair those relationships. Instead, he'd respected my decision to cut ties completely and focus on building a new life without the people who had hurt me so deeply. "Do you want me to leave while you read it?" he offered. "No. Stay, whatever this is," I'd rather have you here. I opened the envelope carefully, extracting a formal invitation printed on heavy cardstock. The text was elegant and traditional, announcing the Harper Family Trust's 5th Annual Conservation Gala, a fundraising event for Colorado wilderness preservation effort. The gala was being held at the Denver Botanic Gardens, with cocktails and dinner followed by an auction of outdoor adventure packages and artwork donated by local artists. What made my breath catch was the personal note written in my mother's handwriting at the bottom of the invitation. Natalie, I hope you'll consider attending. There are some things that need to be said, and this seemed like an appropriate occasion for healing old wounds. Your work in conservation has not gone unnoticed, and I believe you would find the evening meaningful. With love and regret, Mother. Gabriel read the invitation over my shoulder, his hand resting gently on my back as I processed this unexpected development. A conservation gala, he observed. That's quite a coincidence, given your field of work. It's not a coincidence, I said, understanding immediately what my mother was attempting. This is Patricia Harper we're talking about. She doesn't do anything without calculating all the angles. She's researched my career, knows about Summit Conservation Partners' success, and she's using conservation as a way to make contact while positioning herself as supportive of my work. The manipulation was so characteristic of my mother that I almost smiled despite the complexity of emotions the invitation had stirred up. Patricia Harper had always been a master strategist when it came to social situations, capable of crafting scenarios that made her desired outcomes seem natural and inevitable. What's the Harper Family Trust? Gabriel asked, reading the fine print on the invitation. My maternal grandfather established it before he died, I explained. It's supposed to fund charitable causes that align with the family's values, though I never paid much attention to how it actually operated. My mother has always been the primary trust. Gabriel studied the invitation more carefully, noting details I'd missed in my initial shock. This isn't just any fundraising gala, he said. Look at the sponsor list. I read through the names of corporate sponsors and was surprised to recognize several major outdoor companies, including some that were clients or potential clients of Summit Conservation Partners. The gala was positioned as a significant industry event, not just a local Denver charity function. She's done her homework, I said, beginning to understand the scope of what my mother had organized. This isn't just about family reconciliation. She's created an event that I would normally attend as part of my professional responsibilities. Are you going to go? The question hung in the air while I considered my options. Part of me wanted to ignore the invitation entirely, to maintain the distance I'd carefully constructed between myself and my family over the past 3 years. But another part of me was curious about my mother's motivations and what she meant by healing old wounds. I don't know, I admitted. 3 years ago, I would have said absolutely not, but now I'm not sure what I have to lose by seeing what she wants. Gabriel was quiet for a moment, considering my dilemma with the thoughtful approach he brought to all complex situations. What would you want to accomplish if you did go? Closure, maybe, understanding why she encouraged Ryan's affair and whether she's genuinely sorry for the pain she caused, or maybe just demonstrating that I'm not the same person she dismissed as too soft and naive for the real world. And what would you want to avoid? Getting drawn back into family drama, letting old wounds reopen, giving her the satisfaction of thinking she can manipulate me into forgiveness before I'm ready. Gabriel nodded, understanding the delicate balance I was trying to strike. What if we approached it as a business trip? You attend the gala as the CEO of Summit Conservation Partners, networking with potential clients and industry contacts. Whatever happens with your family is secondary to your professional objective. The suggestion had immediate appeal because it reframed the situation in terms where I felt confident and capable. I would be attending as a successful entrepreneur, not as the hurt daughter seeking validation or reconciliation. That actually makes sense, I said, feeling some of the anxiety about the invitation begin to dissipate. Several of the corporate sponsors are companies we've been trying to connect with, and there might be opportunities to expand our Colorado operations. Plus, You wouldn't be going alone. I'll be there to remind you of who you are now if you start slipping back into old family patterns. Gabriel's offer to accompany me to Denver was exactly the kind of support that had made our partnership so successful. He understood that I needed to face my past on my own terms, but he also recognized that having a witness to my current life would help me maintain perspective. Over the next few days, I researched the Harper Family Trust's Conservation Gala more thoroughly and was impressed despite myself by the scope and sophistication of the event. My mother had assembled an impressive array of sponsors, speakers, and auction items, creating what appeared to be a legitimate and significant fundraising effort for Colorado wilderness protection. The guest list included governors, senators, CEOs of major outdoor companies, and prominent environmental advocates. This wasn't the kind of superficial society event my mother had traditionally organized, but rather a serious gathering of people with real influence over conservation policy and funding. She's positioning herself as a major player in Colorado conservation circles, I told Gabriel as we reviewed the event materials together. This could be the beginning of a significant new direction for the family trust, or it could be an elaborate setup designed to impress you with how much she's changed. Gabriel replied with characteristic skepticism about my family's motivation. Both things could be true, I said, recognizing that my mother was entirely capable of pursuing genuine conservation goals while simultaneously orchestrating a family reconciliation on her preferred terms. The decision to attend the gala felt significant enough that I wanted to discuss it with Elena and James, my business partners at Summit Conservation Partner. We'd built our firm on principles of transparency and mutual support, and major decisions that might affect our collective work were always discussed openly. From a business perspective, it's a no-brainer, Elena said when I explained the situation during our weekly partners meeting. The networking opportunities alone justify the trip, and establishing a presence in Colorado conservation circles could open up significant new client relationships. James agreed, but raised concerns about potential complications. What if your family situation becomes a distraction from the business opportunities? What if other attendees know your personal history and that becomes the focus instead of your professional accomplishment? That's a risk I'm willing to take, I replied, realizing as I spoke that I was genuinely curious about how I would handle seeing my mother and potentially Vanessa after 3 years of complete separation. I think I need to know whether I've really moved beyond the anger and hurt, or whether those feelings are still controlling my choices. Gabriel supported my decision to attend, offering to handle the travel arrangements and coordinate with our Denver contacts to maximize the business value of the trip. His practical approach to the logistics helped me focus on the professional opportunities rather than dwelling on the emotional complexity of returning to my hometown. The week before the gala, I received a second communication from my mother, this time a brief email asking if I would be willing to have lunch with her the day after the event. The message was carefully worded, acknowledging that I might prefer to keep any family interaction separate from the professional networking occasion. I understand if you'd rather not, the email concluded, but I hope you'll give me the opportunity to apologize properly and explain some things that you deserve to understand about the circumstances surrounding your marriage to Ryan. The reference to explanations about my marriage to Ryan intrigued me despite my weariness about my mother's motivations. What could she possibly know about that situation that I didn't already understand? The affair had been straightforward enough. Ryan and Vanessa had fallen into a relationship that they'd justified by claiming I was holding him back professionally and personally. She might have information about how long the affair really went on, Gabriel suggested when I showed him the email, or about other people who were involved in encouraging or facilitating it. Do you think I should agree to meet with her? I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But if you do meet with her, maybe suggest a public place where you can leave if the conversation becomes manipulative or hurtful. Gabriel's suggestion made sense, and I replied to my mother's email agreeing to lunch at a restaurant in downtown Denver with the understanding that I would be flying back to Portland that afternoon and wouldn't have time for an extended conversation. The gala was scheduled for a Saturday evening in mid-October when Colorado's aspen trees would be at peak autumn color and Denver's weather would be crisp but pleasant for an outdoor event at the Botanic Garden. Gabriel and I planned to arrive Friday afternoon, giving us time to settle in and prepare for what would likely be an emotionally complex weekend. The flight to Denver felt different this time compared to my business trip for the Outdoor Industry Summit 6 months earlier. Then I had been nervous about encountering Ryan but confident in my professional accomplishments. Now, I was returning to face the family members who had orchestrated the betrayal that had changed the entire trajectory of my life. "How are you feeling?" Gabriel asked as our plane descended toward the familiar mountain landscape surrounding Denver International Airport. "Strangely calm," I replied, surprised by my own emotional state. 3 years ago, the thought of seeing my mother would have sent me into a panic. Now I'm just curious about what she has to say. Gabriel squeezed my hand as we prepared for landing. "That's probably a sign that you've processed most of the anger and hurt. You're not that broken person anymore, Natalie. You're someone who's built an incredible life on your own terms." The hotel Gabriel had booked was in downtown Denver, close to the Botanic Gardens but far from the suburban neighborhoods where I'd lived during my marriage to Ryan. The distance felt symbolic, as if I was visiting Denver as a tourist rather than returning to a place that held painful memories. Friday evening we had dinner at a restaurant I'd never been to during my years in the city, deliberately choosing somewhere that wouldn't trigger memories of my former life. The conversation focused on business plans for the coming year and our personal goals for expanding Summit Conservation Partners' influence in environmental policy. "Whatever happens with your family this weekend," Gabriel said as we walked back to the hotel, "I want you to remember that you have a life and work that matter to thousands of people. You're not asking them for anything. You're not seeking their approval. You're simply allowing them the opportunity to acknowledge who you've become." His words helped me frame the weekend in terms that felt empowering rather than threatening. I wasn't returning to Denver as someone seeking reconciliation or validation. I was there as a successful entrepreneur who happened to have family connections in the city. Saturday morning, Gabriel and I attended a breakfast meeting with Colorado environmental leaders who were interested in expanding Summit Conservation Partners' work in the Rocky Mountain region. The conversation was productive and energizing, reminding me that I had legitimate professional reasons for being in Denver that had nothing to do with family drama. The afternoon was spent preparing for the gala both professionally and personally. I reviewed the guest list and identified key contacts I wanted to connect with, while also choosing my outfit carefully. The black cocktail dress I'd brought was elegant but understated, designed to project confidence without appearing to be trying too hard to impress. As Gabriel adjusted his tie in the hotel room mirror, I realized that I was looking forward to the evening with genuine anticipation rather than dread. "I want to see what kind of event my mother has put together," I told him, "and I want people to see that the Harper family includes someone who's actually doing meaningful conservation work." The Denver Botanic Gardens had been transformed for the gala, with elegant lighting, highlighting the autumn foliage and temporary structures creating intimate conversation areas throughout the outdoor spaces. The overall effect was sophisticated and environmentally conscious, exactly the kind of event that would appeal to the conservation-minded business leaders and philanthropists in attendance. Gabriel and I arrived fashionably late, entering the gardens as the cocktail hour was reaching its peak energy. I immediately recognized several faces from the outdoor industry, including executives from companies that were clients or prospects for Summit Conservation Partners. Natalie Martinez, the voice, belonged to Senator Jennifer Walsh, Colorado's senior senator and a prominent advocate for wilderness protection legislation. "I've been hoping to meet you. Your work with corporate conservation partnerships is getting attention in Washington." The conversation with Senator Walsh led to introductions with other prominent attendees, and within an hour I was engaged in substantive discussions about environmental policy and conservation funding with some of the most influential people in Colorado politics and business. "You're making quite an impression," Gabriel observed during a quiet moment between conversations. "I don't think anyone here sees you as Patricia Harper's daughter. They see you as Natalie Martinez, the CEO who's changing how businesses approach environmental responsibility." His observation was gratifying because it confirmed that I was being recognized for my professional accomplishments rather than my family connections. The networking was going better than I'd hoped, with several potential new clients expressing interest in Summit Conservation Partners services. I hadn't seen my mother yet, though I'd spotted Vanessa across the garden during the cocktail hour. My sister looked older than I remembered, elegant in a navy blue dress, but somehow less vibrant than she'd been during our last encounter 3 years earlier. She was accompanied by a man I didn't recognize, someone who appeared to be a date rather than a serious romantic partner. The dinner portion of the evening featured a seated meal for 300 guests, with speakers between courses highlighting different aspects of Colorado conservation efforts. I was surprised when the program indicated that I would be introduced as a special guest, someone whose work exemplified the kind of innovative conservation partnerships the Harper Family Trust was committed to supporting. "Did you know about this?" I asked Gabriel, showing him the program. "No, but it's not surprising. Your mother is clearly positioning this entire event around showcasing your success while creating an opportunity for reconciliation." The moment came during the salad course when my mother approached the podium to address the assembled guests. She looked exactly as I remembered, elegant and commanding in a silver dress that complemented her carefully styled hair. Her presence seemed to fill the entire space as she spoke about the importance of supporting innovative approaches to environmental protection. "Tonight I want to highlight someone whose work exemplifies the kind of creative thinking we need to address the environmental challenges facing our state and nation," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. "My daughter, Natalie Martinez, is the CEO of Summit Conservation Partners, a consulting firm that has revolutionized how outdoor companies approach conservation partnership." The spotlight found me at my table and I stood to acknowledge the polite applause while feeling a complex mixture of pride and weariness about my mother's public recognition of my achievement. Natalie left Colorado 3 years ago to pursue her vision of creating meaningful partnerships between business and environmental organizations. My mother continued, "Tonight we celebrate not only her success, but also her return to the conservation community where she belonged." The implication that I belonged in Colorado's conservation community was clearly intentional, my mother's way of suggesting that my place was here rather than in Oregon. But the recognition itself was genuine. I found myself appreciating the platform she was providing for my work, even while questioning her underlying motivation. After dinner, the auction began with adventure packages and artwork that had been donated to support Colorado wilderness protection efforts. The bidding was spirited and successful, raising over $200,000 for conservation projects throughout the state. As the evening wound down, my mother finally approached a table where Gabriel and I were sitting with several other conservation professionals. "Natalie," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed genuine despite our years of estrangement, "I'm so glad you came. You look wonderful, and your presentation about corporate partnerships was exactly what this audience needed to hear." "Thank you," I replied, standing to accept her embrace while maintaining emotional distance. "You've put together an impressive event." The fundraising total exceeded my expectations. "Conservation has become a passion of mine over the past few years," she said, glancing meaningfully at Gabriel before continuing. "I've come to understand that protecting our natural heritage requires the kind of innovative thinking that you've brought to your work." Gabriel stood and extended his hand to my mother. "Mrs. Harper, I'm Gabriel Martinez. It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Please call me Patricia," my mother replied, accepting his handshake while studying his face with obvious interest. "I've heard wonderful things about your company and your partnership with Natalie." The conversation continued for several minutes, with my mother asking thoughtful questions about Summit Conservation Partners and Gabriel responding with diplomatic professionalism. I could see her assessing him, trying to understand the nature of our relationship and his influence on my life and career decisions. "I hope we can talk tomorrow," she said as the conversation concluded. "There are some things I'd like to share with you about your father's conservation work that I think you'd find meaningful." The reference to my father was unexpected and intriguing. He had died when I was in college, and I'd never known that he had any particular interest in environmental issues. "I'll see you for lunch," I confirmed, committed now to hearing whatever explanations or apologies my mother felt compelled to offer. As Gabriel and I left the gardens and returned to our hotel, I reflected on how different the evening had been from my expectations. Instead of feeling like an outsider returning to a place that held painful memories, I'd felt like a professional attending a successful industry event, where I happened to have personal connections. "Your mother is more complex than I expected," Gabriel observed as we discussed the evening. "The event was genuinely impressive, and her recognition of your work seemed authentic rather than manipulative. She's always been good at organizing events and managing social situations." I replied. What I can't figure out is whether this conservation focus represents a genuine change in her values, or whether it's elaborate theater designed to impress me. Maybe both things can be true, Gabriel suggested. People are capable of genuine growth while also pursuing strategic objectives. That night I lay awake thinking about the upcoming lunch with my mother and what she might want to tell me about my father's conservation interest. Tomorrow would complete whatever process had begun with her invitation to the gala, providing the closure or understanding that I hadn't realized I was seeking. Whatever happened, I felt confident that I could handle the conversation as the person I'd become rather than reverting to the insecure daughter I'd been when I left Denver 3 years earlier. I had built a life and career that mattered, with a partner who supported my ambitions and values that aligned with meaningful work. My mother could no longer hurt me with her assessments or expectations, because I no longer needed her approval to know my own worth. Tomorrow's conversation would be interesting, but it wouldn't determine anything fundamental about my identity or future. That power belonged to me now. The restaurant my mother had chosen for our lunch meeting was neutral territory, an upscale bistro in downtown Denver that held no memories from my former life. I arrived 10 minutes early, wanting the psychological advantage of being seated and composed when she walked in. Gabriel had offered to accompany me, but I'd declined, knowing this conversation needed to happen without witnesses or buffers. Patricia Harper entered precisely on time, dressed in a cream-colored blazer and pearls that projected understated elegance. She looked older than I remembered, with fine lines around her eyes that suggested the past 3 years hadn't been entirely easy for her either. As she approached my table, I noticed a hesitation in her usually confident stride. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said, settling into the chair across from me with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I wasn't sure you would come. I'm curious about what you have to say," I replied evenly, maintaining the emotional distance I'd carefully cultivated. "Especially about my father's conservation work that you mentioned last night." My mother ordered a glass of white wine despite the early hour, while I stuck with sparkling water. The small detail felt symbolic of the different ways we approached difficult conversations. Her need for artificial courage contrasted with my willingness to face discomfort directly. "Your father would have been incredibly proud of what you've accomplished," she began, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years. "The conservation gala last night would have meant everything to him." "I never knew Dad was interested in environmental issues," I said, genuinely puzzled by this revelation. "He was passionate about it, but quietly so. Your father believed that protecting wilderness areas was one of the most important responsibilities of his generation." Patricia paused to sip her wine before continuing. "He established the Harper Family Trust specifically to fund conservation efforts, though he died before we could fully implement his vision." This information contradicted everything I thought I knew about my family's values and priorities. During my childhood and young adulthood, the trust had seemed focused on traditional charitable causes like hospital wings and scholarship funds, not environmental protection. "Why didn't you tell me about this before? Why didn't you pursue his conservation goals until now?" My mother looked genuinely uncomfortable, fidgeting with her wedding ring in a gesture I remembered from my childhood. "Because I was focused on other priorities. Social standing, business connections, making sure you girls had every advantage I could provide. I thought your father's environmental interests were impractical idealism. What changed your mind?" "Your success," she said simply. "When I started researching what you'd accomplished with Summit Conservation Partners, I began to understand what your father had been trying to tell me about the importance of environmental protection. You've proven that conservation work can be both meaningful and financially sustainable." The admission was startling in its honesty. My mother was acknowledging that I had succeeded in areas where she'd failed to understand the potential, that my career path had validated my father's vision in ways she hadn't previously appreciated. "I owe you a profound apology, Natalie," she continued, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the conversation. "Not just for encouraging Ryan's relationship with Vanessa, but for consistently undervaluing your capabilities and judgment." The apology I'd thought I wanted to hear felt strangely anticlimactic, now that it was finally being offered. 3 years of building my own life had diminished the power my mother's opinions held over my sense of self-worth. "Why did you encourage Ryan to leave me for Vanessa?" I asked, needing to understand the reasoning behind the betrayal that had changed everything. Patricia took a longer sip of wine before answering, clearly struggling with how to explain her motivation. Because I thought Vanessa was stronger, more ambitious, better equipped to help Ryan achieve the kind of success I valued. I was wrong about what strength actually means. You were wrong about what I was capable of becoming when I wasn't constantly being told I wasn't good enough, I corrected gently. Yes, she agreed, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since sitting down. I spent so many years comparing you unfavorably to Vanessa that I never saw your actual strength, your empathy, your ability to build genuine relationships, your talent for bringing people together around shared goals. Those are the qualities that have made you successful in ways I never imagined possible. The conversation paused while our server brought salads that neither of us seemed particularly interested in eating. I used the break to process my mother's words, trying to determine whether her apparent transformation was genuine or another form of manipulation. What happened with Vanessa and Ryan? I asked, genuinely curious about the aftermath of their betrayal. Their marriage lasted less than 2 years, Patricia said with a sigh. They discovered that relationships built on ambition and convenience don't survive when circumstances change. Ryan lost his job at Creative Edge after a major client scandal, and Vanessa found herself supporting someone she'd lost respect for. That must have been difficult for you to watch. It was devastating, my mother admitted. Not because their marriage failed, but because I realized I'd encouraged the destruction of your happiness for a relationship that was fundamentally superficial. I watched Ryan struggle with unemployment and depression, while Vanessa became increasingly bitter about the choices she'd made. The information about Ryan's professional difficulties surprised me, though I felt no satisfaction in learning about his struggles. If anything, I felt sorry for him, remembering the ambitious man I'd once loved who had apparently lost his way completely. Where are they now? Ryan moved back to his hometown in Kansas to work for his father's construction company. Vanessa is still in Denver, but she's changed careers entirely. She's working as a yoga instructor and seems to be trying to find meaning in her life that doesn't revolve around professional advancement. The idea of my hyper-ambitious sister teaching yoga classes was so unexpected that I almost smiled. Perhaps the past 3 years had been transformative for everyone involved, forcing all of us to reconsider our priorities and assumptions about what constituted a successful life. Do you think she's happy? I asked, surprising myself with genuine concern for Vanessa's well-being. I think she's learning to be honest about what she actually wants instead of what she thought she should want, Patricia replied. Much like I've been doing since watching your success from a distance. The conversation shifted as my mother began sharing stories about my father that I'd never heard before. His passion for protecting Colorado's wilderness areas, his quiet funding of environmental education programs, his belief that conservation work was essential for future generations. She spoke about him with a warmth and understanding that seemed to have developed after his death, as if she'd spent years coming to appreciate aspects of his character that she'd overlooked while he was alive. He would have understood your career choices immediately, she said, pulling out an old photograph of my father on a camping trip I barely remembered. You inherited his ability to see the bigger picture, to care about things that matter beyond immediate personal gain. The photograph showed a younger version of my father grinning beside a campfire with mountains in the background. I could see elements of my own face in his features, a resemblance I'd never noticed before. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, studying the photograph. Because I want you to know where your passion for conservation comes from, and because I want to ask for your help in fulfilling your father's vision for the trust. The request wasn't entirely surprising, given the elaborate conservation gala and my mother's obvious research into my professional work, but the way she framed it, as continuing my father's legacy rather than simply expanding my business, gave the proposal additional emotional weight. What kind of help? I want to transform the Harper Family Trust into a major force for conservation funding in Colorado and throughout the Mountain West. Your expertise in corporate partnerships could help us leverage our resources in ways that would have much greater impact than traditional grant-making. The proposal was professionally intriguing, offering the opportunity to work on conservation efforts at a scale that would dwarf anything Summit Conservation Partners had accomplished so far. but it would also mean regular collaboration with my mother and potentially moving back to Colorado. I'd need complete autonomy over the conservation programs, I said, surprised to find myself seriously considering the offer. No interference in strategic decisions, no attempts to manage how I approach partnerships or allocations. Agreed, Patricia said immediately. I've learned enough about your work to know that your judgment is far better than mine in these areas, and this wouldn't require me to relocate to Denver. Gabriel and I have built our life in Portland, and I won't compromise that for any professional opportunity. Of course, the trust can operate with you providing strategic direction from wherever you choose to base your operation. We spent the next hour discussing the practical aspects of how such a collaboration might work, with my mother demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of conservation funding and partnership development that impressed me despite my wariness about her motivation. There's one more thing I need to tell you, she said as our conversation began to wind down, about the night you discovered Ryan's affair. I tensed, unsure whether I wanted to hear additional details about that devastating evening. I knew he was planning to tell you that night at dinner. I encouraged him to do it then because I thought it would be kinder than letting the deception continue any longer. The revelation that my mother had known about the timing of Ryan's planned confession added another layer of complexity to that night's event. She hadn't simply encouraged the affair, she'd helped orchestrate the specific circumstances of my discovery. Did you know he was going to be so careless with his phone? Did you plan for me to find out through text messages instead of a conversation? No, Patricia said firmly. That was Ryan's cowardice, not my planning. I thought he would have the courage to tell you directly instead of letting you discover it accidentally. But you weren't surprised when I left Denver immediately afterward. I was devastated, she corrected. I thought you would be angry and hurt, but I expected you to stay and fight for your marriage, or at least for your place in the family. I never imagined you would have the strength to walk away completely. The admission that my mother had underestimated my capacity for independent action was perhaps the most honest thing she'd said during our entire conversation. She had orchestrated my betrayal but failed to anticipate that I might respond by creating an entirely new life, rather than accepting the role she'd envisioned for me. I'm glad you underestimated me, I said, meaning it completely. If you'd predicted my reaction accurately, you might have found ways to prevent me from leaving, and I never would have discovered what I was capable of achieving. Patricia nodded slowly, seeming to understand that my gratitude for her underestimation was not forgiveness for her betrayal, but rather acknowledgement that her failure to constrain me had inadvertently set me free. Will you consider the trust collaboration? She asked as we prepared to leave the restaurant. I'll discuss it with Gabriel and my business partners, I replied. If we can structure it in a way that complements, rather than competes with Summit Conservation Partners' existing work, it might be beneficial for everyone involved. I hope you will, not because I'm seeking forgiveness, or trying to repair our relationship, but because the combination of your expertise and the Trust's resources could accomplish conservation goals that neither could achieve alone. As we stood to leave, my mother surprised me by making no attempt at a dramatic reconciliation or emotional appeal for renewed family closeness. Instead, she simply thanked me for my time and expressed hope that we might be able to work together professionally in the future. Walking back to my hotel, I reflected on how different the conversation had been from my expectation. Instead of seeking my forgiveness, or trying to justify her past actions, my mother had focused on acknowledging her mistakes, and proposing a way forward that might benefit conservation efforts regardless of our personal relationship. Gabriel was waiting in our hotel room, reading industry reports, while monitoring his phone for any urgent business communications. He looked up expectantly as I entered, clearly curious about how the lunch had gone. She apologized, I said, settling beside him on the couch. Genuinely and specifically, without trying to minimize the impact of what she did or make excuses for her motivations. How did that feel? Anticlimactic, honestly. 3 years ago I thought hearing her apologize would heal something fundamental inside me, but I've already healed those wounds on my own. Her apology was nice to receive, but it didn't change anything essential about my life or happiness. Gabriel nodded with understanding, You don't need her validation anymore because you've proven your worth to yourself. Exactly. But she also offered something unexpected. She wants Summit Conservation Partners to help transform the Harper Family Trust into a major conservation funding organization. I explained the details of my mother's proposal, outlining both the opportunities and the potential complications of working with family money to advance environmental protection efforts. What's your instinct about it? Gabriel asked after I'd finished describing the conversation. That it could be incredibly impactful for conservation work, but only if we can maintain complete professional autonomy and avoid getting drawn back into family dynamics. Are you worried about your mother trying to use the collaboration to rebuild a personal relationship with you? No, actually, that's what surprised me most about today. She seems to genuinely understand that our personal relationship is irreparably damaged, and she's not trying to use professional collaboration as a backdoor to emotional reconciliation. Gabriel and I spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the practical implications of the trust collaboration, how it might complement our existing work, and what safeguards we would need to ensure that family complications didn't compromise our business relationship. The flight back to Portland that evening felt like the completion of a journey that had begun 3 years earlier with my desperate flee from Denver. I was returning to my chosen home as someone who had not only survived betrayal and abandonment, but had transformed those experiences into the foundation for a meaningful and successful life. Are you glad you went? Gabriel asked as our plane climbed above the Colorado mountains. Yes, but not for the reasons I expected. I thought I needed closure or understanding or some kind of emotional resolution. What I actually needed was to see that I've become someone completely different from the woman they betrayed. Different, stronger, more confident, more aligned with my own values instead of trying to meet other people's expectations. 3 years ago, I was devastated by my family's betrayal because my sense of self-worth depended on their approval. Now I can work with my mother professionally if it serves conservation goals, but I don't need her love or validation to know who I am. As Portland's lights came into view below us, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path that had led me to this moment. The betrayal that had once seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything I could have imagined while trapped in the constraints of other people's expectations. Gabriel reached for my hand as we prepared for landing. So what's next? Next, we build something even bigger and more impactful than what we've created so far. Whether that includes collaboration with the Harper Family Trust or not, Summit Conservation Partners is going to continue changing how businesses and environmental organizations work together. Looking out at the city that had become my true home, I realized that the most powerful form of triumph wasn't revenge against the people who had hurt me, but the creation of a life so fulfilling and meaningful that their betrayal had ultimately been a gift. They had forced me to discover strengths I never knew I possessed, and to build partnerships based on mutual respect rather than convenience or social expectation. The woman who had discovered her husband's affair through anniversary dinner text messages was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was capable of creating positive change in the world. That transformation was the real victory, more satisfying than any revenge could have been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.